Well, folks, thanks so much for joining in again. Those of you in Canada and in the US, and increasing number of viewers who are zeroing in and looking at what we talk about, some of the headlines of the week, trying to take some time off of your hands and actually give you more time by giving you some of the headlines with insights behind it that normally maybe aren't as obvious. So on the weekend wrap up here, let's have a little time of, we'll do some projection, a little bit of reflection. We'll talk about tankers, we'll talk about bankers, we'll talk about some interesting polling showing how some people are feeling lonelier and is there something we can do about it. In the third day now, following the third day of the agreement that looked very strong at the start between the federal government, Prime Minister Carney here in Canada, and the Premier of Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith, and she has been doing some pretty amazing things over the last couple of months in terms of looking at getting government to take an assessment of how they're either helping people or not. And with the big announcement coming of an agreement, it seemed to be between the federal government and the provincial government in Alberta relative to a new pipeline and more pipelines in general. It was brought in with much fanfare. It looked like there'd been great breakthroughs. As you know, before the announcement was made, I had been saying that I don't think it's going to bring the results that we had hoped. And now that we're in the third day, we see from the banking community increasing pessimism. And the reason is that even though the federal government and the provincial government have agreed on things, in terms of also something as remarkable as the federal government realizing that maybe the world is not going to be blowing up in a giant fireball in three days or 3 years, but in fact, maybe the global extremists have been off base. And so the federal government kind of backing off from some of the projections, some of the restrictions that were going to be made environmentally. And people were saying, well, great, this will be a great breakthrough. We'll get to see another pipeline. We'll get to see Alberta's refined natural gas and refined oil products making it to other countries, maybe as far as China to help them get off of their coal, maybe to India to help them reduce their dependence on not just coal, but literally millions of people depending on burning of cow dung in their homes to heat and cook food. And also the possibility that Canadian refined oil products, the best refined oil and gas and natural gas products in the world, getting to Europe to help European countries break the stranglehold that Putin has on them in terms of having to buy his energy products. And so the terrible irony of European countries actually funding Putin's war on Ukraine. All of that, so much of that could be resolved by Canada's natural gas, liquid natural gas, and refined oil products. However, the Premier of British Columbia, along with First Nations, have said that there's no way in the world they're going to allow that pipeline to happen. There's no way they're going to lift the so-called tanker ban on the West Coast, probably then being the only country in the world now that bans certain types of tanker traffic. Tankers now in the last 30 years being made in such increasingly sophisticated ways, double-hulled tankers, the possibilities, the remote possibilities of leakage or an accident being very, very far-reaching, but it doesn't seem to matter. First Nations in British Columbia and actually in Canada are saying, no, it's not going to happen. So now we have, and we've heard it yesterday, as I predicted, and I hope I'd be wrong, that the bank's saying they are not going to be lending to projects that have uncertainty to them, projects that would take years and years and years to get approvals for, and then maybe not get an approval at the final end. So what will happen? Well, I think you're going to see, as the reality of this sets in, what you will probably see is the federal government doing what governments, either progressive or conservative, often fall into the trap. Then they themselves fund these projects that are very expensive. And once you get governments funding the projects, the cost of everything goes up, delays increase, timelines increase. And if in fact the federal government does step in the gap and try and fill that gap with taxpayer dollars that the banks aren't willing to do, it just raises the cost anyway of all those products. The net result is not a good one. So we're not feeling very positive, at least I'm not, and it's increasingly going through the financial community, and this awareness is dawning on people that maybe these new pipeline strategies are not going to be bringing the breakthroughs that they want. Well, listen, let's shift from that to as we realize that Canadian economy, and I think unless there's a change in government, that's the only hope really, unless there's a change in government, I predict you'll continue to see a slowdown in the Canadian economy. And some people are saying this week, oh yeah, but look, there's just been an upsurge in the GDP over the last quarter. And now that we've drilled down further into those numbers, we're starting to realize that what happened, what looked like an increase in the economic strength across the board, really was a result of somewhat of an increase of Canadian, guess what? Energy, oil and gas products moving to the U.S., an increase there in demand because the U.S. economy is so strong, they need more energy from all sources. And so in one sector from Canada, increase in oil and gas exports, that does have an effect on the GDP, but it does not have an effect across the whole economy, so it's very narrow. But here's what was accomplished by that. Since there was a tiny uptick in GDP, if that hadn't happened, what was coming at the Carney government was the fact that the quarter before, there was a startling drop in economic activity, startling to some people, but many of us are saying, well, of course the economy is going to drop anytime you're saying, well, we're just not going to deal with the U.S. anymore in the way we were. We're going to deal with China, we're going to deal with Europe, and those are far-reaching aspects. And so we saw a corresponding drop in economic activity in the first quarter. And so in the second quarter, if it hadn't been for the oil and gas sales to the U.S., once you have 2 quarters in a row where there's a drop in the GDP, guess what? You have to report that you are in recession. And for any government to admit that they are in recession is devastating in the polling numbers. So the federal Liberal government were able to dodge that bullet because in the second quarter, because of this increase in oil and gas sales, in fact, it appeared as though there was not a dip in overall economic activity. So what that has done, it has bought some time for the Carney government. Here's another quarter goes by, because remember, you have to have 2 quarters in a row where you report a drop in GDP. Then that's technically a recession. The Liberals dodged that bullet. That means that even if this quarter goes into recession, that's another 3 months. And then you have to have a following one of 2 in a row, of quarters where there's a drop in economic activity. So the Liberal government has not just dodged the bullet, they will, no matter how bad it gets, they won't have to report a recession for another 2 quarters. That's half a year, folks. We can be just smiling along and thinking everything's fine when actually we're in full recession mode there. That could be a definite time of concern, and I think we're into that time right now. So that means more and more people relying on government to bail out, and Prime Minister Carney has said anytime that there's going to be a downturn, he's just going to plow more money, that's borrowed money, into whatever the problem is, which only creates more of a problem. Don't want to get you depressed, but on the note of what happens when a government, when business does not produce the type of jobs and economic strength we want, I want you to look at a stat that's just come out of the U.S., and it's reflected also in Canada, but in this one, it's showing that from 18 to 39-year-olds, 53% in that very vital voting group, 53% now saying they like the idea of a socialist government. Now, this is startling because we're talking about the United States of America, which is the last holdout really in the world against strong socialist policies and, in fact, socialist governments. And here you have that giant voting bloc of 18 to 39-year-olds saying, you know what, they'd be okay with socialism. Only 36% in that voting bloc saying they would not be okay with that. Well, why is that? As we've talked before, a couple of reasons. It's been now about 50 years, about 5 decades of very strong culturally Marxist teaching in our schools and university, which is always proposing socialist answers to problems. But so why aren't older people falling prey to that victim? Why are they more concerned about socialism? One of the reasons, certainly in Canada and in the US, with, in the past, the more distant past, a wide number of immigrants coming to our countries from countries which had experienced socialism in the extreme. They saw that socialism in the long runs takes away from an incentive, and actually economies turn down as people become more dependent, and more tough government programs and policies have to be put in place. Many of the people who form the older generation, so-called, in Canada and the US have actually experienced extreme socialism. They want no part of it, but folks, I hate to say it, the older ones are dying off, the younger ones are rising up, and a real concern. What do we do to address this? One of the things that has to happen at the political level, we have, for instance, conservative parties will generally be less socialistic in terms of their economic policy, but at the same time, we're not teaching, we're not talking about it, we're not explaining in detail to a younger generation why socialism actually leads to increased poverty levels for everybody and an overall drop in the standard of living. We're not explaining that. It's not being taught in our schools. That becomes more and more of a voting bloc that is going to be demanding more government involvement in every area of our lives, not really an overall healthy prospect. In terms of unhealthy stats and unhealthy numbers, the stats were just released yesterday. In terms of the MAID program in Canada, we understand what that means for our US listeners and watchers. MAID is medical assistance in dying. That's what that is, and that's, you can call it planned suicide, you can call it whatever you like. But when this legislation was being brought in Canada several years ago, many of us said this was going to spread and it would become more commonplace to see people requesting doctor-assisted suicide. Of course, those of us who raised the concern at the time, we were laughed at, we were called heretics, we were called extremists, we were called alarmists, and it would only be used where, and the phrase that was used is where foreseeable death is imminent, and in those cases you could choose to have a doctor end your life for you, medically assisted assistance in dying. And in fact now, the stats for Canada, almost 17,000 people last year were actually, they used this legislation, they got doctors to end their lives, so it was doctor-assisted suicide, 17,000 people. And what has been said when these stats are released is it's decreasing, the number is decreasing. No, it's not decreasing. The rate of increase is going down, and which would be obvious as there's less older people who are around and wanting to have their lives ended. Then it still increases, but at a slightly slower rate this last year. 17,000 people choosing to have their lives ended, and an increasing number of those are in the category where they are not defined as foreseeable death. These are people, you got to take that in, please listen to that. People who have not been diagnosed as seeing death in the foreseeable future are being put to death at their request. A big portion of that is actually, a certain portion of that portion is they just see no prospects of happiness for the future. They are lonely people in many cases. They are people who have no hope. Sometimes it's a certain component of that is the disabled community, and even the United Nations back in 2021 were reminding countries and telling countries you better put in some legislation that makes it difficult for disabled people, persons with disabilities, to request assisted dying, because more and more they are going to be becoming part of that group where it's not death in the foreseeable future, but it's just the depression that comes with their disability. Government is not listening to any of those warning signs and is going ahead, and the increasing number of people who are requesting their lives be ended, and it's not because there's foreseeable death. It's just they don't see any future for themselves. A big part of that is loneliness, which brings me to something I want to tell you about, since the weekend edition is a time for some reflective thought, not so much a long list of incidents and things that are happening day by day. When I was out this morning, I saw something interesting, and it was a person sitting on a park bench and holding a cute little dog. And an older person, another older couple had stopped, and I thought, oh, they must be showing them their grandbaby, because there's the little baby stroller that they're pushing. And in fact, it was the older people with the cart introducing the puppy, introducing the dog in their cart to the dog of the person sitting alone on the bench. And at first I thought, that is so ridiculous. And you know, I'm a dog lover, and we had dogs when our kids were young, and I sometimes reflect on how we're going from God worship to dog worship across our society. Having said all that, and people can certainly make those choices, it did strike me first as a bit of a sad commentary that these people were taking time introducing their dogs to each other. And then I thought, that guy on the bench, he looks kind of lonely, and maybe that older couple are kind of lonely. And in fact, it was because of the dogs they were stopping and having a chat together. And then I kind of smiled at myself, and the fact is, our dogs actually making us a little bit more human, realizing that we need to be reaching out to each other. That was certainly what was happening with these folks that I just passed by on the street. Do you know, many people, again, we look at stats as people are aging out, and we see it in our seniors' homes, we see it in communities where, 55 plus communities or older communities, and more, and we see this and we hear this, where older people are telling us they never hear from their kids. They never hear from their grandkids. Their lives are becoming increasingly lonely and increasingly depressed. You know, my wife and I are thankful and blessed that we have kids and grandkids who call us or text us, and so we usually don't go for too long a period of time without hearing from someone in our family. But that's not the case for literally millions of people across Canada and the U.S. I was talking to a woman in a senior's home not long ago, and she said that her son lives right in the same neighborhood, same city, and never calls, never stops by. So good for those people introducing their dogs to each other. That's going to, help them out a little bit. But maybe this weekend, there's somebody that you could call. Maybe a family member, somebody you haven't, and specifically a family member, maybe a parent, maybe a relative that's alone, that hasn't heard someone from a long time. Maybe your phone call could make the difference between them being part of that statistic that we just talk about it. Think about it as you enjoy your weekend, and reach out, touch somebody who may be alone this weekend. Talk to you on Monday.